Hey y'all, Bud Rednauer with New Haven Church. I just started reading through the Gospel of Mark, and I paused here in chapter 9 because I thought there were a couple of good points that I thought were worth mentioning this week. So buckle up, because we're going to look at a few different types of power through a good old-fashioned Bible study, and I've got mine, so grab yours. So here we are in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, and starting in verse 22, Jesus heals a boy with an unclean spirit, and so far his disciples haven't been able to cast the demon out. So the Father's describing to Jesus what happens every time the spirit convulses him. And so starting here in verse 22, he says, "And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And then in verse 23, "And Jesus said to him, 'If you can.'" All things are possible for one who believes. So, number one, in verse 23, we see the power of belief. Here, Jesus indicates that the Father could participate in the healing of his Son by believing in Jesus. As Jesus puts it, all things are possible for one who believes. All things includes a lot of things. But we could also flip it and call it the power of unbelief. Is there a great work of God just waiting to be done in your life, but your struggle with believing in God's goodness, faithfulness, maybe even his willingness to do it is hindering that great thing from taking place? How much of God's awesomeness have we missed out on because of our unbelief? Just as we see how powerful belief in Jesus is, we see how powerful unbelief is in keeping God from moving in our midst. Let's do as the Father does and cry out to God to help us with our unbelief, which leads us to our next point, prayer. Number two, in verse 29, we see the power of prayer. Now that Jesus has cast out the demon, we see the disciples ask Jesus privately why they couldn't cast him out. They're like, "What's up with that?" And in verse 29, he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." And some translations have but prayer and fasting. This is an indication of the power of prayer. You see, the disciples didn't struggle with the lack of belief. They struggled with the lack of prayer. You and I are going to have problems in life that we are just going to have to take directly to our Heavenly Father through prayer. And here's the cool thing. If we struggle with point one, unbelief, then we can go ask Jesus through the practicing of prayer, point two, to help us with our unbelief. Lord, I believe. Lord, help my unbelief. And then number three, you see we move on to verse 30 and 31, and we see the power of discipleship. Picking up in verse 30, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples." Here's an understatement. Jesus values discipleship. And here he demonstrates the need for quality time to teach, to mentor, and to produce disciples. Why? Because disciples reflect the master, or are supposed to anyway. Now, I'm not saying this is definitely the reason why back in verse 22 that the boy's father says, "Jesus, if you can." But I could understand why his belief in Jesus may be half-hearted after seeing his own disciples fail to cast out the demon. Remember, disciples reflect the master. Your disciples couldn't do it, so if you can? But obviously, yes, Jesus can and will. He's able. He is good. And Jesus commands us to go and make disciples, Matthew 28. Discipleship is powerful because it builds and encourages a humble spirit, obedience to God, a servant-like mindset through investing in others, and it creates a spirit of unity. So I hope that this quick look at the 9th chapter in the Gospel of Mark has been helpful as we looked at the power of belief in Jesus, the power of prayer, and the power of discipleship. For more information, you can reach us at newhavenbc.com, facebook.com/newhavenbc, and for more videos like this or our Sunday services, check us out on YouTube.